When Uncle Henry came in from the barn with old Shep at his heels, and Cousin Anne came down from upstairs, where her sewing machine had been humming like a big bee, they were both duly impressed when told that Betsy had set the table and made the apple sauce. They pronounced it very good apple sauce indeed, and each sent his saucer back to the little girl for a second helping. She herself ate 3 saucerfuls. Her own private opinion was that it was the very best apple sauce ever made. After supper was over, and the dishes washed and wiped, Betsy helped with the putting away. The 4 gathered around the big lamp on the table with the red cover. Cousin Anne was making some buttonholes in the shirtwaist she had constructed that afternoon, Aunt Abigail was darning socks, and Uncle Henry was mending a piece of harness. Shep lay on the couch and snored until he got so noisy they couldn't stand it, and Cousin Anne poked him in the ribs, and he woke up snorting and gurgling and looking around sheepishly. Every time this happened it made Betsy laugh. She held Eleanor, who didn't snore at all, but made the prettiest tea-kettle-singing purr deep in her throat, and opened and sheathed her needle-like claws in Betsy's dress. "Well, how'd you get on at school?" asked Uncle Henry. "I've got your desk," said Elizabeth Ann, looking at him curiously, at his gray hair and a wrinkled, weather-beaten face, and trying to think what he must have looked like when he was a little boy, like Ralph. "So," said Uncle Henry. "Well, let me tell you, that's a mighty good desk. Did you notice the deep groove in the top of it?" Betsy nodded. She had wondered what that was used for. "Well, that was the lead pencil desk in the old days, when they couldn't run down to the store to buy things, because there wasn't any store to run to. How do you suppose they got their lead pencils?" Elizabeth Ann shook her head, incapable even of a guess. She had never thought before but that lead pencils grew in glass showcases in stores. "Well, sir," said Uncle Henry, "I'll tell you. They took a piece off the lump of lead that they made the bullets of, melted it over the fire in the hearth down at the schoolhouse till it would run like water, and poured it in that groove. When it cooled off, there was a long streak of solid lead, about as big as one of our lead pencils nowadays. They break that up in shorter lengths, and there you'd have your lead pencils, made while you wait. I tell you, in the old days, folks knew how to take care of themselves more than now." "Why weren't there any stores?" asked Elizabeth Ann. She could not imagine living without buying things at stores. "Where did they get the things to put in a store in those days?" asked Uncle Henry argumentatively. "Every single thing had to be lugged clear from Albany or from Connecticut on horseback." "Why didn't they use wagons?" asked Elizabeth Ann. "You can't run a wagon unless you've got a road to run it on, can you?" asked Uncle Henry. "It was a long, long time before they had any roads. It's an awful short chore to make roads in a new country, all woods and hills and swamps and rocks. You were lucky if there was a good path from your house to the next settlement." "Now, Henry," said Aunt Abigail, "do stop going on about old times long enough to let Betsy answer the question you asked her. You haven't given her a chance to say how she got on at school." "Well, I'm awfully mixed up," said Betsy complainingly. "I don't know what I am. I'm 2nd grade arithmetic, and 3rd grade spelling, and 7th grade reading, and I don't know what in writing or composition. We didn't even have those." Nobody seemed to think this very remarkable, or even very interesting. Uncle Henry, indeed, noted it only to say, "7th grade reading." He turned to Aunt Abigail. "Oh, Mother, don't you suppose she could read aloud to us evenings?" Aunt Abigail and Cousin Anne both laid down their sewing to laugh. "Yes, yes, Father, and play checkers with you too, like as not." They explained to Betsy, "Your Uncle Henry is just daft on being read aloud to when he hasn't got something to do in the evening, and when he hasn't, he's as fidgety as a broody hen if he can't play checkers. Anne hates checkers, and I haven't got the time often." "Oh, I love to play checkers," said Betsy. "Well now," said Uncle Henry, rising instantly and dropping his half-mended harness on the table, "let's have a game." "Oh, Father," said Cousin Anne in the tone she used for Shep, "how about that piece of breeching? You know that's not safe. Why don't you finish that up first?" Uncle Henry sat down again, looking as Shep did when Cousin Anne told him to lie down on the couch and took up his needle and awl. "But I could read something aloud," said Betsy, feeling very sorry for him. "At least I think I could. I never did, except at school." "What shall we have, Mother?" asked Uncle Henry eagerly. "Oh, I don't know. What have we got in this bookcase?" said Aunt Abigail. "It's pretty cold to go into the parlor for the other one." She leaned forward, ran her fat forefinger over the worn old volumes, and took out a battered blue-covered book. "Scott?" "Gosh, yes," said Uncle Henry, his eyes shining. "The Staggered Eve." At least, that was the way it sounded to Betsy, but when she took the book and looked where Aunt Abigail pointed, she read it correctly, though in a timid, uncertain voice. She was proud to think she could please a grown-up so much, as she was evidently pleasing Uncle Henry. But the idea of reading aloud for people to hear, not for a teacher to correct, was unheard of. "The stag at eve had drunk his fill, where danced the moon on Monan's rill," she began, and it was as though she had stepped into a boat and was swept off by a strong current. She did not know what all the words meant, and she could not pronounce a good many of the names. But nobody interrupted to correct her, and she read on, steadied by the strongly marked rhythm, drawn forward swiftly from one clanging, sonorous rhyme to another. Uncle Henry nodded his head in time to the rise and fall of her voice, and now and then stopped his work to look at her with bright, eager old eyes. He knew some of the places by heart evidently, for once in a while his voice would join the little girl's for a couplet or two. They chanted together thus: "A moment listened to the cry that thickened as the chase drew nigh. Then, as the headmost foes appeared, with one brave bound the copse he cleared." At the last line Uncle Henry flung his arm out wide, and the child felt as though the deer had made his great leap there, before her eyes. "I've seen him jump like that," broke in Uncle Henry. "A 200-300-pound stag go up over a 4-foot fence just like a piece of thistledown in the wind." "Uncle Henry," asked Elizabeth Ann, "what is a copse?" "I don't know," said Uncle Henry indifferently. "Something in the woods must be. Underbrush, most likely. You can always tell words you don't know by the sense of the whole thing. Go on." And stretching forward free and far, the child's voice took up the chant again. She read faster and faster as it got more exciting. Uncle Henry joined in on, for jaded now and spent with toil, embossed with foam and dark with soil, while every gasp with sobs he drew, the labouring stag strained full in view. The little girl's heart beat fast. She fled along through the next lines, stumbling desperately over the hard words, but seeing the headlong chase through them clearly as through tree trunks in the forest. Uncle Henry broke in a triumphant shout. The wily quarry shunned the shock and turned from the opposing rock, then dashing down a darksome glen, soon lost to hound the hunter's ken. In the deep Trossach's wildest nook his solitary refuge took. "Oh, my!" cried Elizabeth Ann, laying down the book. "He got away, didn't he? I was so afraid he wouldn't." "I can just hear those dogs yelping, can't you?" said Uncle Henry. "Yelled on the view, the opening pack." "Sometimes you can hear 'em that way on the slope of Hemlock Mountain back of us, when they got to running a deer." "What say we have some popcorn?" suggested Aunt Abigail. "Betsy, don't you want to pop us some?" "I never did," said the little girl, but in a less doubtful tone that she ever used with the phrase so familiar to her. A dim notion was growing in her mind that the fact that she had never done a thing was no proof that she couldn't. "I'll show you," said Uncle Henry. He reached down a couple of ears of corn from a big yellow cluster hanging on the wall, and he and Betsy shelled them into the popper, popped it full of snowy kernels, buttered it, salted it, and took it back to the table. It was just as if she was eating her first ambrosial mouthful that the door opened, and a fur-capped head was thrust in. A man's voice said, "Evening, folks. No, I can't stay. I was down at the village just now, and thought I'd ask for any mail down our way." He tossed a newspaper and a letter on the table and was gone. The letter was addressed to Elizabeth Ann, and it was from Aunt Frances. She read it herself while Uncle Henry read the newspaper. Aunt Frances wrote that she had been perfectly horrified to learn that Cousin Molly had not kept Elizabeth Ann with her, and that she would never forgive her for that cruelty, and when she thought that her darling was at Putney Farm, her blood ran cold. It positively did. It was too dreadful, but it couldn't be helped, for a time anyhow, because Aunt Harriet was really very sick. Elizabeth Ann would have to be a dear, brave child and endure it as best as she could, and as soon as she ever could, Aunt Frances would come and take her away from them. Don't cry too much, darling. It breaks my heart to think of you there. Try to be cheerful, dearest. Try to bear it for the sake of your distracted, loving Aunt Frances. Elizabeth Ann looked up from this letter and across the table at Aunt Abigail's rosy, wrinkled old face, bent over her darning. Uncle Henry laid the paper down, took a big mouthful of popcorn, and beat time silently with his hand. When he could speak, he murmured, "And 100 dogs, bayed deep and strong, clattered in 100 steeds along." Old Shep woke up with a snort, and Aunt Abigail fed him a handful of popcorn. Little Eleanor stirred in her sleep, stretched, yawned, and nestled down into a ball again on the little girl's lap. Betsy could feel in her own body the rhythmic vibration of the kitten's contented purr. Aunt Abigail looked up. "Finished your letter? I hope Aunt Harriet is no worse. What does Frances say?" Elizabeth Ann blushed a deep red and crushed the letter together in her hand. She felt ashamed, and she did not know why. Aunt Frances says, she began, hesitating. "She says Aunt Harriet is still pretty sick." She stopped, drew a long breath, and went on. "And she sends her love to you." Now, Aunt Frances hadn't done anything of the kind, so this was a really whopping fib. But Elizabeth Ann didn't care if it was. It made her feel less ashamed, though she didn't know why. She took another mouthful of popcorn and stroked Eleanor's back. Uncle Henry got up and stretched. "It's time to go to bed, folks," he said. As he wound the clock, Betsy heard him murmuring, "But when the sun his beacon red